The Joe Rogan Experience.
It's a perfect time to have you on. I mean, this is, when we're talking about free speech in the time when the president of the United States has been banned off of Twitter and Facebook, and it's a wild time. What do you make of that?
Well, Facebook and Twitter are private publishers, right? I mean, we don't exactly know what they are. They're not exactly like the Times or like NBC or ABC. But they're close. They're certainly in the private sector, and the private sector has always had the discretion. It's their First Amendment right to decide who to publish and who not to publish. It's different with Facebook and Twitter because they claim to be platforms like the telephone company that anybody can use to have conversations, but they're not quite that. They really are a lot like a publisher. And, if the Times decided to fire one of its columnists because it didn't like what he wrote, they have a First Amendment right to do so. And they're not the government. So, to that extent, what Facebook and Twitter did is perfectly legal and not really different than what a publisher or a broadcasting company would do if it decided to change or fire one of its anchors or one of its columnists. On the other hand, they are sort of like a platform, like an electronic soapbox that they've erected in a park and invited everybody and anybody to come. And when they start picking and choosing, no, you're not good, you're okay. When they start being a gatekeeper, you run the risk of them closing people out of a national dialogue and depriving people of an audience, basically. And that's a problem. And it's a problem we haven't figured out how to work out yet because this medium is in its infancy. People forget that the printing press started in the 15th century in 1400 and something, and it took hundreds of years before freedom of the press and worked itself out in ways that we're familiar with now. And we're right at the beginning of this internet speech medium, and it's hard to say. I think Facebook and Twitter had the right to do what they did in banning Trump. But the question is, if they start banning anything that they don't like, then they're really closing off the public conversation to people. And what's the criteria? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's also, it seems to me that we're using these outdated things to compare, like comparing it to the printing press or comparing Facebook or Twitter to publishers or even comparing them to something like a utility, like the power. There's something new. There's something completely different. Yeah. And I hope it's not going to take hundreds of years to have some sort of a freedom of expression online in these things, but they're monopolies. It's not like anybody could have bought or made a printing press and printed their own books or printed their own newspapers. Not everyone can make their own Twitter. It's so complex and there's so many users on it. There's very few places where you could legitimately get your word out in a way that you can with Twitter or express yourself.
Well, but and it's true that this medium is analogous to utilities in some ways, analogous to publishers in some ways, but they are new and they're different. That's right. But consider this: when I was growing up, I was a teenager in the 50s. A big problem with free speech and the democratization of free speech was that nobody had access to anything. I mean, you had the Times, you had the Washington Post, you had the Hearst newspapers, you had NBC and ABC and CBS, and that's where most speech occurred. And nobody had access to that. So even with the monopolistic bans that Twitter and Facebook are doing these days or can do, have the power to do. The fact is that many, many millions more of people, ordinary people, have access to huge audiences than did 50 years ago. If you couldn't get into the Times and you couldn't get into the Washington Post, and if you couldn't get onto television, you could speak. You were free to speak, but nobody heard you.
Yeah.
And so, it's a lot better now, even with questions about abusing the power of being a gatekeeper that Twitter and Facebook have.
Yeah, it's just such a strange time for this, because it's in the middle of like we're at the end of the president's run. He's still in office, but yet he's, everybody wants him out as quickly as possible because you're wondering what he's going to do, and he can't really express himself publicly anymore. It's just so strange.
Yeah, well, of course, he's still the president. If he held the press conference, everybody would cover it.
That's true.
And he, if I used to say back in the day that my father was a construction worker with a 5th grade education, and if he had something to say, he could say it to me. He could say it to our family at Thanksgiving, but he didn't have access to an audience of the kind that Roosevelt had when he went on the radio. And he couldn't get into the Times as easily as the governor of New York, if the governor of New York held the press conference. So, it isn't different in that respect. I'm not too worried about a president not having access to a public audience. A president has tremendous power to attract attention, and that was true 100 years ago. What I'm worried about are ordinary people. What I'm worried about are people like you, people, who have something to say, but their freedom is that they get to say it in the closet, where nobody hears them. There's an interesting story, a real case that happened in the 60s when James Meredith, who was the first black person to enter the University of Mississippi, was shot when on his first day there, and it was a real outrage. It was in the early '60s, and a man named Sidney Street, a black guy living up in Harlem in New York, was so angered that he wanted to say American ideals, American principles of liberty and equal rights have just gone up in smoke today. And if he had stood on a street corner at 145th Street in Harlem and stood up on a soapbox and said that, the only people who would have heard him were a few dozen people who passed him on that street corner. So what he did is he got out on the street corner and he burned an American flag. It was his flag. He owned it. So he wasn't destroying anybody else's property. He burned the American flag, and by burning the American flag, he attracted television cameras, which his words by themselves would not have attracted. So the television cameras came, and he got to say, I'm burning this flag to symbolize the fact that if a guy like James Meredith can get shot just for going to school, America's ideals have gone up in smoke. And he got onto the 6 o'clock news, and millions of people heard his words. And he was prosecuted for burning the flag, which was a crime at the time. And his case eventually went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled it and said it was symbolic speech. But the reason that I'm telling that story is that it demonstrates how before there was an internet, people had to figure out dramatic things to do to get their message to more than a handful of people. And that's why, Benjamin Spock burned draft cards. That's why Sidney Street burned the flag. That's why there were demonstrations instead of just words. And it worked all right for some people, but for the most part, most people could not get their messages out to large audiences until the internet came. And so even with Twitter and Facebook acting as gatekeepers in ways that trouble us, because we don't know what the limits are, we don't know what the standards are, and we don't know why we should be having these private people decide who gets to hear what. But even with that, the ability of ordinary people today to reach huge audiences with whatever it is they want to say is much, much larger. I mean, by orders of magnitude larger than it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago.
Oh, unquestionably. But it just concerns me when a corporation has the ability to dictate, even if it's a problem president, even if it's someone as crazy as Trump, just when a corporation gets together and they decide that this guy can't use their platform anymore, a platform that hundreds of millions of people use. It just seems very strange.
Well, it is a problem because there are no standards.
Right.
And that's what I mean when I say we're just at the beginning of thinking about how to do that. I mean, here's what I see as the issue. If you allow Facebook and Twitter to make these decisions in the same way that you allow the Times and the Washington Post and television networks to decide what they publish, then you run the risk of arbitrary exclusions from people's speech reaching large audiences, not just the president, who has alternative means, but ordinary people. The only way to remedy that is by law. The only way to remedy that is to give the government the power to regulate what these corporations can do. And all of our history shows that if you give the government the power to regulate speech, you're going to be in a lot worse shape than if you allow the private sector to do it. Because who in the government are you going to give that power to? You're going to give it to Trump? You're going to give it to Giuliani? You're going to give it to Joe McCarthy? You're going to give it, to Roosevelt during the war, who might have barred Japanese Americans from speaking to large audiences? I mean, who are you going to give that power to? And our entire history shows that the only way to regulate private power is through government power. And if you regulate speech through government power and you give the government the power to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak, we will be in far worse shape than we are in having the private sector do that.
Catch new episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience for free only on Spotify. Watch back catalog JRE videos on Spotify, including clips. Easily, seamlessly switch between video and audio experience. On Spotify, you can listen to the JRE in the background while using other apps and can download episodes to save on data cost, all for free. Spotify is absolutely free. You don't have to have a premium account to watch new JRE episodes. You just need to search for the JRE on your Spotify app. Go to Spotify now to get this full episode of the Joe Rogan Experience.